Welcome to the Music is My Life podcast from Berklee Online. I'm your host, Pat Healy, and take note of Steven Wilson, who has been a part of a dozen musical projects and or bands, most notably Porcupine Tree, with whom he released 10 studio albums and 12 live albums between 1992 and 2012. They broke up in 2009, and Wilson has been focused mostly on his solo career ever since. He released his 6th album, The Future Bites, earlier this year, and he still involves himself in several collaborative endeavors, including a podcast called The Album Years, which he co-hosts with Tim Bowness, who incidentally was one of Wilson's first formative musical collaborators, beginning in the mid-1980s with the band No Man. But Steven Wilson's musical life started earlier than that. When I asked him when, he knew precisely the moment. Let's let him tell you all about it.
That's a very easy question to answer because it's one of the fundaments of my musical DNA is the music that my parents listened to one Christmas in around I don't know exactly which year it was, but I reckon it's around 1975. And they got records for Christmas. They gave each other records for Christmas. And my father received Dark Side of the Moon from my mother. And my mother received Donna Summer's Love to Love You Baby from my father, which is one of the great Giorgio Moroder productions from the mid-70s, Donna Summer records. And those two records I would hear in rotation, basically, over and over again. I was about 6 years old, and I think it was basically brainwashing me. And to this day, I still feel those two records are kind of the very basis of my musical DNA. So the more conceptual rock side of the Pink Floyd record, and the rock instrumentation, and the groove aspect and the electronic aspect of the Donna Summer record, which, interestingly enough, that Donna Summer record also has a track which takes up the whole of side one, which is also a kind of a musical journey in its own right. So that kind of aspect of tracks not necessarily being concise 3.5-minute pop songs was definitely instilled in me from a very early age. Yeah.
That's amazing that you can pinpoint it, and it's just such a perfect combo, and it's really just so easy to untangle once you say that. It's just like, oh, yeah.
It makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah.
So when did you first start picking up instruments and playing?
Well, my parents made me have, like a lot of kids, my parents kind of forced me to have music lessons when I wasn't interested, and we had a guitar in the house, and we had a kind of organ, electronic organ. So I was sent off for piano lessons as well, and I hated them both. But it was too early. I was only interested in football or soccer at the time, so I wasn't interested. But around about the time when I started to fall in love with music, which was probably 2 or 3 years after that scenario I've just outlined for you, for myself, becoming actually passionate about music for myself rather than something that I was being forced to be interested in, I kind of rescued the acoustic guitar, the rather forlorn by this time and ignored and marginalized acoustic guitar that had been banished into the attic. I rescued it and I started to tune it so I could play chords open, on the open strings, and started to write my own quote unquote songs. So I think I was about 10 years old maybe. And of course I didn't have any technique or anything. I didn't know the names of any chords, didn't know how to play chords, but I was already interested, I suppose, in pure sound. I was interested in sound. Even at that age, I was more interested in the way things sounded than the technique per se, which is something that's continued throughout my whole career, really.
Yeah, I really like that philosophy. And in listening to one of your podcasts that you do in the album years, you're talking about, the technique is one thing, but having something to say is so much more important. And I appreciate that coming from somebody who in your field,
I think it's fair to say that most of the great music, not all, but most of the great music has been made by people who were essentially idiots. And I mean that in the nicest possible sense of the word. People who were not, not able to read or write music, people who were not necessarily trained or playing in the prescribed way, but just had a natural creative urge and a natural creative gift. Whether it's Bob Dylan or Paul McCartney or, whoever it is, I don't think. The problem is that when you get incredibly trained musicians, they end up playing prog metal or jazz fusion, which are forms of music that don't appeal particularly to me. And to be fair, they don't appeal to most music listeners. They end up appealing to other musicians or other people that want to play that kind of music. Great music that really speaks to people and really transcends that is usually made by people who are kind of approaching music in a very kind of intuitive, unself-conscious way. And of course, there are exceptions. Jeff Buckley was trained at music college, for example. But I do think that's largely a pretty good rule of thumb for me.
And tell me about your training. So when you were doing the open chords and you were done with lessons by this point, I'm guessing, right?
I was never the kind of person who took to lessons very easily. That doesn't just apply to music, that applies to my education as a whole. But my parents, when they realized I was now interested in music, belatedly, they did send me back to have some proper guitar lessons. But what would basically happen is that the guitar teacher would tell me to learn a piece, and I would go away, and I was supposed to learn the piece for homework, and I would come back the following week and he would say, okay, can you play me the piece that I asked you to learn, Stephen? And I'd say, no, but I've written my own. And essentially I would have written my own piece that was kind of inspired by the thing that he'd wanted me to learn. And of course, they hated me for that, but that was always my thing. And still to this day, I can't really play anybody else's music. I'm a terrible sort of musician party guest, because musician party guests are usually the kind of people that can, get them over to the piano and the acoustic guitar, and they'll play you the entire Beatles back catalogue. I can't play anybody else's music. I can only play my own music. I'm just not that interested. So I was a terrible student, terrible pupil.
So when you started writing, were you recording these things?
I was recording almost from the point I was making music. Yeah, and again, I think that's kind of unusual, perhaps less so now when recording technology is relatively easily accessible through computers. But we're talking late 70s, early 80s here. And I was interested in the possibilities of recording almost before I was interested in the possibilities of songwriting. I was very, very lucky because my father was an electronics genius. That was his job. He was an electronic engineer. And he built me very early on. I was about 11 or 12 years old. He built me my own little cassette Porter studio, which allowed me to overdub myself, playing a guitar part, adding another guitar part, adding a voice, And that's incredible. When I think back to think that I was at the age of 12 or 13, I was exploring the possibilities of essentially multi-track recording without really knowing what I was doing. But again, it's kind of testament to the fact that that was really more where my interest lay. The technique and the performance was less interesting to me. The magic you could create with overdubbing and multi-tracking yourself I was completely in awe of that process, So to have a dad that was able to give me the facility to be able to, to learn how to do that was really unusual, obviously, and a gift. Yeah.
Wow. And did either of your parents or anybody in your family also play?
No. I come from a family that have no musical, interest at all, really. Apart from, they loved to listen to music, but they had no interest in playing or singing or anything like that. And I'm not quite sure where it came from. It didn't seem to come through the gene pool. Let's just say that.
Right. So, researching you, and I'd been somewhat familiar with your work, but I had never done a deep dive. And it seems you've been in like a dozen bands, right?
I've been in a lot of projects. Some of those bands, in inverted commas, are some of them are just me, working under project notes. I've been in a few bands. I mean, I was famously in a band called Porcupine Tree, which started off as a solo. So the first 3 Porcupine Tree albums are just me overdubbing everything myself. But we became a band.
Right.
And that band made another 7 records and toured the US many times and did quite well. A lot of the other bands I've been in have been more project-based things where it's been me, maybe one other person, and we've made a record. And I haven't experienced the band life really much beyond Porcupine Tree, which was touring for about 15 years as a kind of democratic, 4-piece unit.
It must almost be more relieving to do projects because, everybody kind of knows each other's how invested they are, right?
The thing about being in a band is it's hard for a bit of a control freak like me to be in a kind of band environment where you do have to make compromises. And I think part of being a professional musician is understanding in what context you are able to give your best. And I realized after a fairly long time in that band, and I was still the captain of the ship. I mean, I wrote most of the music and all that stuff. But essentially, you still do end up giving away some of your freedom, particularly freedom to change direction, to reinvent yourself, to try different musical styles. Because obviously, one of the things by definition about being in a band is that you have to find common ground. And that common ground is essentially the little part of the Venn diagram in the middle where you're 4 people in a band. There's a little part in the middle of the diagram where those 4 circles intersect. And that's what you all can agree is the kind of music you want to make. So if the bass player, for example, is into jazz and dub, as our bass player was, and the keyboard player is into electronic music, as he was, and I was into sort of rock and all. So we kind of found this common ground, and that became quite limiting to me because I wanted to be able to change direction almost from album to album, and it's part of the beauty of my solo career is I'm able to do that, and I have done that. And I don't think I could have ever done that I know I couldn't have done that within the context of a band. So some people I think are made to be in bands and love that kind of camaraderie and the democratic kind of aspect of it. Some people like me find it essentially or ultimately to be a little bit limiting. And that was why I started 10 years ago. I kind of finished with any band project and started as a solo artist.
So what was the first proper band or the first collaborative project? Was that Altamont?
Altamont was, there were so many things I did when I was at school. I think I had a different project name every week. Altamont was one of those, which was me and another guy at school messing about with some analog keyboards. Probably the week after we would have had a different name, Mm-hmm. But that project at least got as far as making a sort of demo tape that was circulated a bit. So it has some slightly more immortality than most of the projects I was involved in at the time. The first real collaboration I was involved in was a band called No Man, which was myself, my partner Tim Bowness, who we're still kind of working together occasionally, and a violin player. And that was the first band that kind of put one foot in the world of professional music for me. We did get a record deal. We did get a publishing deal. We did release some records on relatively big label. We didn't really become that successful, and it was very much a niche thing, but it was the thing that enabled me to become a professional musician and to be able to give up any sort of ideas of doing anything else with my life. And that was around about my late teens, early 20s that started to happen.
Was your family, you said they weren't that into playing music, were they supportive of that decision though?
Initially, no, but later, yes. I think when my mum and dad heard me on, things like on the radio for the first time, I think they began to understand it was something that potentially could give me a career. I mean, I think any parent, almost any parent, is going to be worried when their child comes to them and says, I want a career in the creative arts, because it doesn't matter if it's music, cinema, whatever it is. It's such a heartbreaking, unpredictable world to be in. There's so much luck involved, so much being in the right time. There's a lot of nepotism involved. You have to be able to put up with criticism that feels like it's a criticism of your very being, your very essence. And I think that's something that sometimes people who don't make music don't understand, that when they criticize you or say your new album is rubbish or something, it's not like they're criticizing an essay you've written for a school course or something, or how you've put how you've installed a boiler in a house or something like that. They're criticizing something that for you started with a dream, that you could create something magical out of your own imagination. You could create something magical and move other people with it. And you then dedicate your life to that, and you put your blood, sweat, and tears into creating something that you believe is magical and that people can relate to and empathize with. And then for somebody else to dismiss that is incredibly hard to take. And a lot of people, of course, are never able to deal with that. And a lot of people end up leaving the creative arts because of that sensitivity. And, I've struggled with that too over the years. I found a way to deal with it, which is simply to not read anything. I don't read any comments. I don't read any online feedback. I don't read any reviews. Of course, I still get to hear about them because my friends will come up and say, "Oh, I saw that thing on, in this, and they said that about you." I said, "Don't tell me. I don't want to know." But sometimes you can't avoid those things, and it's still incredibly hard to deal with.
Yeah, what you're talking about reminds me of that diatribe Lou Reed has in the middle of his Take No Prisoners album.
Oh, I don't know that. What does he say?
It's so great.
Yeah.
He's just like, it's like a 20-minute version of Take a Walk on the Wild Side, and he's just playing live, and he talks about, I think, who's Robert Trisco from...
the journalist. Yeah.
And he's like, I spend 2.5 and he gives me a B+. Like, what is it, school?
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, at least he got a B+, imagine it's been a D-. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
that's something incredible. I think that's something that you never really completely come to terms with. The idea that you create something from the heart and soul, and then somebody just dismisses it with a 2 out of 10 rating or a E- could do better. So there's so much that goes on, and it's a very heartbreaking industry, and it takes a particular kind of person, I think, to be able to push through and to kind of block all that out and focus on just being creative no matter what.
What was your first introduction to this harsh world of criticism?
So I remember, early on, those, like I mentioned before, that band No Man, we got our first record deal, and we got some great reviews early on, but we also got some terrible reviews. I remember one of our early singles was reviewed by Stephen Morris from New Order in Melody Maker, which was one of the big music papers here at the time.
Yeah.
And he was incredibly dismissive. And I was a big New Order fan, so it was twice as heartbreaking. It's like, oh my God, this person, I grew up listening to Joy Division music and New Order and all this stuff, and he hates what I do, and that was really hard. And some of those things take days to pick yourself up from, It's like, I'm going to give up. It's a waste of time. I'm kidding myself, And as I say, I think a lot of people never do pick themselves up from those kind of early blows. I've had people in my band, people have joined, because I'm a solo artist, I have people my band lineup changes quite often. And my last drummer, Craig Blundell, a great drummer, but he was following in the footsteps of 2 superstar drummers that had been in my band, or 3, in fact. I'd had Gavin Harrison, Chad Wackerman, and Marco Miniman had been my previous 3 drummers. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know those guys. They're extraordinary drummers. And Craig was relatively unknown. And I knew he was going to be given a hard time on social media. And I said, look, don't read it, okay? Don't read it. But it was almost like he couldn't help himself. He was like drawn to it. He's like, couldn't help himself reading it. And people are incredibly judgmental and incredibly, his first ever gig with me, people were judging him in comparison to, say, Marco's 100th gig with me,
Right.
And he took it incredibly badly. And I remember having to sit down with him and, sort of just kind of give him a pep talk and say, look, all you should worry about is whether I'm happy, with what you're doing. And I am. And you're getting so much positive feedback. So, I think the other thing about it's human nature is to be always obsessed with the one bad review out of the 100.
Mm-hmm.
So you get, it's like for me, when I play a show and there's like 3,000 people in the room, how many people in the room? If there's one person in the front row that's yawning or looks like they're not enjoying it, the whole show becomes just for them. This fucking show is just for you now. I'm going to make you like this. And the thing is, you don't know what, they might have been dragged along by their boyfriend or girlfriend. They might have had a long night. You don't know why they're not enjoying it, but for whatever reason, they're not. But that you kind of obsess over that. And I think it's the same with reviews. 100 reviews or 100 comments online. If there's one in those 100 that is less than positive, that's the one that you obsess over. And I think that's almost a universal thing.
Right. So you and Tim do No Man, and you pick yourself back up after the bad review from Stephen Morris. Are you two aware at this point that this is something that you will move on from, or are you telling yourselves like, this is it, we're going to, ride this to the end?
No, I think we definitely thought that we were in it for the long run. And to be fair, No Man has, it still exists. It has been in it for the long run.
Right.
But what happened almost simultaneously was that I, being so interested in the world of production and sound design and recording and multi-tracking and all that stuff, almost immediately I started to make any decent money from the music industry, which would have been the advances we were paid by the record labels and the publishing companies at the beginning. I put all that money into starting to put together my own home studio facility. I didn't want to be working on the clock. I didn't want to have the pressure of time. I wanted to be able to explore, and I wanted to be able to make mistakes. I wanted to be the person who would spend 3 days programming a hi-hat pattern and then decide it wasn't right and throw it away. And you can't do that if you're paying, £600 or $600 or whatever it is a day for a commercial recording studio. So this is way back in the late 80s, before it was fashionable to have your own studio. I was putting together my own recording setup. So I had an old analog 16-track machine. I had a mixing board, some outboard stuff. And because of that, because I had my own studio, I also had the time to do stuff that wasn't to do with No Man. It wasn't to do with my quote-unquote day job. I had all this free time, to do other stuff. So I started to mess about with other musical genres, and particularly exploring musical styles that kind of, in a way, were nostalgic for 60s and 70s music, conceptual rock, psychedelia, space rock. And I called it Porcupine Tree in a moment of insanity when I wasn't thinking it was going to be anything serious, and started to send out a few tapes. And what do you know? It started to build an audience in the way that No Man had not and was not. And this is without the support of record labels and publishing companies. It started to get noticed. It got played on the radio. It got some press, some great reviews early on. Almost without me trying, I had found something that seemed to be giving me more of a potential career than No Man was or had. And that's how Porcupine Tree started. And so at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, my emphasis would have probably shifted from Porcupine Tree to No Man.
Right. And do you think that the comfort of just taking your time with this led to this different sort of expression in Porcupine Tree, or with less pressure, less label people looking over your shoulder?
Absolutely, because we're talking the late 80s here when it started, and you cannot imagine how disinterested most so-called tastemakers would have been in anything that kind of referenced the 70s or the 60s or the 80s. I think there's that famous maxim, isn't it, that says you have to have at least 1 decade's distance from anything before it will become fashionable again. Mm-hmm. So, the most unfashionable music tends to be the music from the previous decade. And the 70s was so unfashionable. So here I was making music that was kind of harking back to, a time of conceptual rock music, a lot of music that people would have called hippie music, whatever derogatory term they would come up with. So it wasn't anything I imagined would ever get any traction. But maybe I was lucky that I was just on the cusp of that time when people were ready to reappraise that kind of music. And so the late 80s, people were just beginning to get a little bit more nostalgic for what had happened in the 70s and the 60s. So the music started to engage and actually really become successful and popular, almost, as I say, almost despite my efforts.
Were you still continuing with No Man for a while?
No Man have never stopped. Yeah, so No Man, partly because I have such a great musical relationship with Tim, and even though I say I'm not particularly made to be in bands or collaborations, the thing with Tim is slightly different because Tim is a singer, lyricist, and I am more of a sort of producer, instrumentalist. So we kind of gel quite well together. When I write with him, obviously I'm not the singer, and he's not a musician. So we have that kind of dynamic between us, almost like the Bacharach and David thing, So that's always worked very well, and I've always enjoyed working with Tim, and continue to do so. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I love the podcast. And are you planning on doing another season?
We are. So, excuse me. As soon as I have a bit more time, because I'm very busy at the moment, as you can imagine, with promoting this new record. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're planning to start up again, probably in a couple of weeks' time. Yeah, we love it.
That's great.
It's just two guys nerding off about music. What's not to love about that? Yeah.
Yeah, how did you two stumble upon this idea?
Well, we didn't really stumble upon it in the sense that we've always been like that, and I think ever since the first time we met, we've just been 10% work, 90% arguing about music and arguing about records and other artists. And you can tell from listening to the podcast how kind of passionate and curious we still remain about what's out there. And so it was really just this idea of, when the pandemic came along and we both realized we were going to have a lot more time to think of other ways to be creative, if you like, that I sort of said to Tim, why don't we just take our arguments and our discussions about, music into the context of a podcast and see if anyone's interested. And we hit upon the idea, let's not talk about the obvious records, because there's so much been written about all the canon records, the Sgt. Peppers and all those, and the Blonde on Blondes and the Neverminds and all those. We thought, let's talk about the records that people don't talk about necessarily. And each episode is dedicated to a particular year, as you know, because you've listened to it. And we try to pick the records from that year that perhaps are not the obvious ones, and in that sense, try and introduce people to music that they may not be familiar with. It's been a lot of fun, I have to say, and the reaction has been just phenomenal.
Yeah. The only thing I was surprised is the 1998 episode that you didn't mention Neutral Milk Hotel at all.
Well, the simple answer to that is I'm not familiar. I'm just not familiar. So it is a very personal thing. And I think we're quite honest. We say, look, we haven't heard everything. And I think somebody complained that we hadn't mentioned, what was it? Somebody else complained that we hadn't mentioned, REM. We hadn't mentioned REM. And I've never been particularly an REM fan. And I'm quite honest about that, so it is a very personal, it's a very subjective thing, obviously. I'm aware of the name of the band you've just mentioned, but I've never listened to that record, and I have to go and fix that, and I apologize deeply for that oversight.
Yes, no, it's the type of thing that's so much fun to listen to, because as you listen, you're like, oh, they're going to mention this one, right? They have to mention this one.
Right.
But yeah, no, I was surprised just because it's a concept album that came out in 1998, and I thought, of course, they'll do concept albums.
Well. My musical ignorance. I'm not familiar with that record. I've heard a couple of. You're not the first person to have mentioned it subsequently, and it's certainly on the list. Isn't that the beautiful thing about music, though? That even when you think you know everything, and I'm 53 now. I've been listening to music for more than 40 years. The beautiful thing is that there are still things from the past that I haven't discovered yet. From the present and the past, but particularly from the past, because you'd think 40 years of listening, you'd have pretty much heard everything that's been out there and been made that would kind of resonate with you. And I'm still finding the capacity to be surprised by things that somehow I've just blipped out and never experienced and never heard. And that is a perfect example.
And how about playing music? Are you still finding things in playing and creating music that you'd never thought of before?
Absolutely. And the way I've done that is by pretty much trying to do something different with every record, which is a very interesting way to conduct your professional career. It's a challenging way to conduct your professional career. Most people, they will find a formula, they'll build an audience, and then they'll essentially deliver more of the same kind of formula to the audience, to keep them engaged, to keep them buying the records. And I've kind of done the opposite. I've constantly destroyed things that were successful in order to create something different and new. And I know why I've done that. Partly because I love so many different kinds of music, and there are so many things I want to do with what limited gifts I have as a musician. And partly I think also because most of the people that were really inspiring to me growing up and became my idols were the kind of people that constantly confronted expectations. So the Bowies, the Kate Bushes, the Frank Zappas, the Neil Youngs. There's not a long list of people that have done that, but those are the people that have really. Prince was another idol of mine when I was a kid. That you never quite knew what you were going to get when they released their next record, and it became all about them having such a unique kind of musical world and musical personality that it almost didn't matter that they were changing their musical vocabulary from album to album. In fact, I kind of loved that about them. And it's something I've always wondered about, why more musicians don't do that. And I kind of understand on one level, but at the same sense, I look at the world of cinema. And in the world of cinema, directors are almost encouraged to genre hop. Someone like Christopher Nolan or Stanley Kubrick will make a war movie and then a science fiction movie and then a costume drama and then a psychological thriller, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's perfectly acceptable for them to do that. But it's much less accepted in the world of the music industry. People become very attached to genres. Even on myself, I've been very much branded as someone being associated very much with a particular genre. And I fight against it all the time because I don't like that idea that I am a generic artist.
Well, it's funny. It's almost as if you're hesitant to even say the genre.
Well, because part of me almost doesn't like the whole. I don't like the word anyway. I mean, let's be clear about this. The word is progressive rock.
Right.
But the problem with progressive rock, and I truly believe this, is that people that say they make progressive rock by definition don't. That there is something about being progressive and having the progressive spirit that means you have to, in a sense, almost ignore the parameters of that a musical genre creates for you. So truly progressive artists would be the kind of people I mentioned earlier.
Right.
When the notion of progressive becomes a blueprint for a particular kind of music and which you make within a particular set of parameters, it therefore has ceased to be progressive. And that's my problem. And that's why I've always been very reluctant to align myself with that genre, even though I have made albums clearly in that tradition. And I completely acknowledge that. And I love a lot of the music that has been made in that tradition. But I also think most so-called progressive rock I hear these days is nothing of the kind. And so I really am very reluctant to be associated with that idea. Well, to be fair, associated with the idea of any genre, but that's the one I've been most associated with.
Talk to me a little bit about Blackfield. I mean, I feel like that's another. I mean, would you refer to that as a project rather than a band?
It's kind of a project. It started. It's a collaboration between me and an Israeli songwriter called Aviv Geffen, and it started. And this is why I would think of it as a project, because it came from a conceptual starting point. And the concept was, wouldn't it be great to take these great songs that Aviv has written in Hebrew in his home country of Israel, translate them into English, produce them perhaps with a slightly more lush production aesthetic, and let people hear them. And that was the idea that we started off Blackfield with. And that's why most of the music was written by Aviv. And I was more the kind of producer, and I sang a lot of the songs. But the idea was really to bring his songs to a wider audience. And he has this wonderful kind of classical approach to songwriting. He's very much about the 3-minute pop song, which I'm not, or I certainly wasn't at the time. And he writes songs in the classic traditional mold, but they just sound familiar in the sense that a great melodic pop song does immediately have that kind of familiarity. It's a very kind of nostalgic, melancholy, kind of golden quality to what he did. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to start a project with him where we would take some of his existing songs and re-record them in English? And that's kind of what we did. It's changed slightly now. I'm no longer involved in Blackfield. He's kind of taken it. I haven't had the time, essentially. Nothing bad's happened between us, but I just haven't had the time. So he's kind of taken it on as his own project and continues to kind of mind that seam, as it were.
As such a music aficionado, I really love that you had a self-titled album with a song by the same name.
Right.
So it's a very elite group there. So it's like Black Sabbath, the Monkees, Bo Diddley.
That's true, and of course, Sabbath started their first album with the song Black Sabbath. Yeah, we didn't quite manage that. Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about changing hats a little bit. You've done production and you've remixed albums that I'm guessing were hugely influential to you. I guess first talk to me a little bit about production and I think the one thing that everybody knows you for the most with production is the Opeth albums.
Partly because it's about the only thing I have produced, to be honest, that's not mine. I mean, to be fair, you mentioned my remix work. I've done a lot of mixing and remix work. I have rarely done production. And I think the reason is not that I don't enjoy it, because I do, but I think the reason is that production is such a commitment in terms of time to another artist. I would rather be making my own music. I don't think I was put on this earth to produce other artists. I think I was put on this earth to make my own music, to really produce an artist properly. And I know because I've worked with producers on my own records. In fact, my current record, The Future Bites, I worked with a co-producer. And these guys, 3 months of their life is involved in essentially working on someone else's record and kind of like, immersing themselves in the world of that artist. That's not for me. So production is something I've not really pursued. I could have done. I mean, believe me, after those Opeth records came out, I got so many requests from metal bands, to be fair.
Right.
But it was quite easy to turn them down because none of them were as good as Opeth. And I think that's also an issue, is that Opeth was so good that every other metal band that ever asked me to work with them paled. I mean, this is a very personal perspective, of course. Every other metal band that asked me to work with them kind of paled when I considered what Michael and Opeth were doing. It just seems so advanced and out in front of everyone else. Partly because also Michael is not, I'm sure if you know anything about Opeth, Michael is also someone who is not bound to the idea of genre. Of course, Opeth subsequently have reached far beyond the genre that they came from. And I think I kind of recognized that in him early on, and he recognized that in me early on, which is why the collaboration kind of worked so well. But production is not something I've been particularly interested in pursuing subsequently. I like producing my own records, and I have a reputation for making good sounding records, and I'm very happy about that. I'm very proud of that fact.
So when you do get into the remixing of these other classic albums, is that something where, I'm guessing, do you have to have a certain amount of familiarity with it before you'll commit the time to it?
I like to be the kind of person who would approach an album with the sensibility of a genuine fan rather than someone who's doing it because they're being paid to do it. And I think you can tell the difference. When you hear music and the people that have been involved in putting it together are doing it because it's a paid job or because they really have an empathy with the music, the listener can tell the difference. And I've always believed that one of the reasons why my remix projects have been largely pretty well received is that I was coming at them from the point of view of someone who wanted to do right by them. I wanted to do right by the band and the artist, and I wanted to do right by the fans that in some cases had been listening to these albums for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And to be able to bring that sense of not to the point where you're almost too respectful, but at least having enough respect for the music that you didn't want to mess with it or change the way people would relate to it. It's more about sort of shining it up and presenting it in a new context. And mostly, in my case, presenting it in the context of surround sound, which is largely where a lot of my remix project work comes from. This idea that the albums will be remixed into Dolby Atmos or 5.1 or surround sound for the first time. So it's giving people what they already know, but making them hear it in a new way. And I think it's better to be someone that genuinely is a fan. I've done a couple of jobs where I wasn't a fan, but I've ended up being a fan almost by the end of it, which was nice also to come to a record that I wasn't so familiar with, but to kind of fall in love with it by the process of deconstructing and reconstructing it was also fun.
Are there any albums that you really have been dying to get your hands on the stems for?
Well, to be honest, anything that has an element of sonic excellence in the production lends itself really well to being remixed into surround sound. Anything that has layers, anything that has a strong element of sound design to it, Those are the things that really work, the best in surround. Little details that you can position behind the listener or above the listener in Dolby Atmos. So, obvious things for me. I would love to have worked on Kate Bush's catalog, but unfortunately she's not interested, which is fair enough. Not everyone is. Prince, I would love to do the classic Prince albums, the 80s Prince albums for me. They're seminal works for me. But anything that sounds great, is produced great. I'm such a kind of fan of sonic excellence in music and production in music. And there are so many great records that I just think would be incredible in a true immersive three-dimensional audio experience. So, there's a couple of names for you anyway. Certainly Kate Bush and Prince would be probably very near the top of my list of things I'd love to do.
Speaking of future bites, there's definitely a lot less guitar in this, and you talk about pivoting from what people expect from you. At what point did you realize that this was the direction you were going to go with your work?
When I was picking up the guitar and boring myself with what I was doing with it. Now, this is no reflection on the guitar. Well, partly a reflection on the guitar. I do feel like the guitar is becoming a little bit less relevant in today's musical climate. But anyway, that's by the by. The problem was for me, limited though I am as a guitar player, whenever I picked it up, I found myself going to the same chords, the same kind of progressions, and I was boring myself. And that's not a good feeling when you're trying to write, when you're trying to be creative. To be inspired, of course, is stands to reason, most important thing. And yet every time I would wander over to the synthesizer, I would get almost immediately excited by, just turning on an arpeggiator on a keyboard, or stepping up to an old analog keyboard like a Mini Moog or a Prophet 5 or an ARP 2600, something like that, and just the unpredictability of what would happen when you started playing around with those old analog keyboards. And I was immediately excited. And that's really all you're looking for. When you're writing songs, you're looking to find something that excites you and can become something you can build on in terms of being a songwriter. And the guitar just wasn't doing that for me anymore. So that was really the moment when I acknowledged to myself, the guitar is not going to be key to this record. It will still be part of the musical vocabulary, will still be there, but it'll be more of a kind of peripheral element. And the central element of this album is going to be electronic sound. And when I acknowledged that to myself was pretty early on, because I was looking for something to give me the momentum to start working on another record. And that was it in this case.
So it's probably besides the point, because there might not be a tour for this album for a while, but I wonder kind of what the set list would have looked like if there were. Would you play some of the old material without guitar or less guitar, or would you choose material that didn't have as much guitar?
I mean, the guitar is still in this music, so it's not like the music is suddenly completely electronic. There are still guitars. Most of the tracks still have real drums on too, with a couple of exceptions. So there's still going to be a need for a great live band. And I'm going to need a great live band anyway, because I am still going to need to play, or want to play, a lot of my back catalogue. There are, let's just say there are certain tracks in my back catalogue that I think will fit better with the Future Bites sound. And there's plenty of those. Going back to the beginning of my career, Porcupine Tree, there's a very early track called Voyage 34, which was a 30-minute long piece of a kind of a fusion between trance music and guitar soloing. And it was I think at the time it was quite unusual. It was quite an unusual thing to release. I think that's the sort of thing that I would love to go out and rescue from my back catalogue and maybe bring it up to date. And it would fit really well with, and I think it's also a fan favourite. So it would be something the fans would love to hear alongside the new material. So there's plenty of stuff in my back catalogue that I think would fit really well with the new material. But there's also going to be a need to have a good old-fashioned rock and roll band as well to play some of the other material, and that will still be a strong part of the show.
Right. You talk about this, so many genres being interested in and playing, and I wonder what to highlight the important parts of your life. What do you go to? Like, what song did you have your first dance to at your wedding?
My wedding, we had two songs. We had Elton John's Tiny Dancer, because if you know that song, it has the classic line about marrying a music man. But it's also a fantastic song. I'm a big Elton John fan. And of course, Elton is on my record as well, which is all comes full circle.
Right.
And the other song, which is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, was Barry White's Never Gonna Give You Up. Classic cheesy slice of mid-70s disco pop, yeah. But those are kind of my wife and those are our songs, yeah.
That's great. And it's almost back to the roots of Dark Side of the Moon meets Donna Summer.
Everything.
Mix.
Yeah, it really does. You're absolutely right. Everything always goes back to that, for me. And the idea that music isn't bound to the idea of the 3-minute pop song, Tiny Dancer and Never Gonna Give You Up, both 7, I think Never Gonna Give Us about 8 minutes long. I love those tracks where you just get locked into a groove and you just explore that groove and all the possibilities of that groove over 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And I've always been doing that right across my career, I guess, yeah.
Steven Wilson getting locked into a groove, exploring a groove, and finding all the possibilities of that groove throughout his whole career. And hey, if you want to explore a groove, or anything music related really, try a course from Berklee Online. And because you listen to this podcast, nevertheless, the credits of this podcast, you'll get $100 off. All you got to do to get started, go to musicismylifepod.com. That's it. You'll find everything you need right there. This episode was edited by Talia Smith, mastered by Jose David Vindesmora, visual assets coordinated by Mike DeBenedictis, social media by Brooke Larson, web assistance comes from Mark Thomas, Steve Zimmerman, and Joe McDonough. I wrote and recorded the Music is My Life theme song, but the expert remixing comes courtesy of Lily Dickinson. Special thanks to Gabriel Reifert Cohen, Ashley Pointer, Big Hassle's legendary Ken Weinstein, Andrew Hobbs, Lassie Hoyle, and thanks to you for listening. Take note to join us on Monday, March 22nd, when our special guest will be none other than Huey Lewis. I'll talk to you then. Stay safe, listeners, and stay inspired.